Good morning. Well, there seems to be at least casual interest in the subject of the program this morning, so we'll get underway. Apologize for the brief delay. I'm Paul Grogan, president of the Boston Foundation. Let me welcome all of you here this morning. I see many, many familiar faces in the group, but for those of you who may be here for the first time, I want to extend a particular welcome. As you know, the Boston Foundation is Greater Boston's community foundation, a 101-year-old charity that over its life has provided $1.5 billion in grants to Boston area nonprofits, and $1 billion of that came in just the last decade. In addition to being the largest grant maker in New England, the foundation, as you know, and this is a perfect example, likes to commission research and precipitate important discussions about the challenges and opportunities we face as a city and a state and a region. Housing has been of particular interest to the foundation going back decades, and many of you know that during the centennial, one of the things we celebrated was the so-called there at the beginning phenomenon, the number of times that the Boston Foundation had provided startup or early stage capital to nascent nonprofits that really grew up to be something, and that's particularly true in the housing and community development field, where literally most of the infrastructure, the extraordinary infrastructure that's been put into place in this city that has done such a spectacular job of revitalizing neighborhoods that were really in decline. The Boston Foundation played a huge role in launching most of those organizations, from the first CDC in the city, now the Community Builders, the national organization, to the Association of CDCs, the Metropolitan Boston Housing Partnership, and the list goes on and on and on. And so this is a familiar subject, and we are nothing if not persistent as we present the 14th annual report card. It's not something that we let go of. Housing is an absolutely crucial issue for this community, and I think we have an exceptional program lined up for you. We're going to hear in a moment from Senator Forry, the chief of the Joint Committee on Housing. She will be followed by the principal author of the report, our friend Professor Barry Bluestone of the Dukakis Center. Then our Senior Housing and Neighborhoods Director, Becky Kepnick, will convene a terrific panel for you and to explore the issues that the report raises in much more depth. A great friend of this foundation's has been Senator Linda Dorcena Forry over many years. She is really doing an extraordinary job representing the 1st Suffolk District, and it's a pleasure to introduce her now. Senator Forry.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you, Paul. Thank you for your great work. I want to thank the Boston Foundation. And this is wonderful that it's the 14th annual report because you all continue to plug away in terms of really tackling issues that are so important to everyone here in the Commonwealth, right? Not just here in Boston. And so it's an honor to be here with you all today. As Paul said, I am the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Housing. I joined that committee with the wonderful Chairman Kevin Honan on the House side, has been doing great work. And I also chair the Special Senate Committee on Housing, so it's great to be here this morning, and I will be brief. I'll say that, it's wonderful to see so many advocates and leaders in the field of housing here today. In the past March, my colleagues and I, as the chair of the Special Senate Committee on Housing, we convene experts throughout the field, experts, advocates, government officials who work in the housing field to identify the problems we face and work to find a series of policy changes we can make to tackle these issues. You're going to hear from Barry this morning, who served on the Special Senate Committee Commission. Rachel is here from CHAPA, and so many others that are here this morning. I can tell you, and you all know this, that across the Commonwealth, low rates of housing production have not kept pace with population growth and needs. Soaring rents have outpaced stagnant wages, while the lingering effects of the foreclosure crisis, expiring affordability controls, and natural physical deterioration has also caused significant loss to our housing stock. Our seniors, families, and young professionals are finding it increasingly difficult to find housing due to inadequately supply and affordability. This housing shortage impacts people across all income levels, but especially those with the lowest income. Day by day, residents fall victim to homelessness or are forced to make painful choices against ever-rising rents and necessities. The committee came up with 19 proposals, which we believe would have made meaningful progress in the future of Massachusetts housing policy. The recommendations included a wide range of areas, including foreclosure, gentrification, homelessness, preservation and rehabilitation, production, public housing, support services, and zoning. And since the report's release and through the work done by my colleague, Chairman Kevin Honan, and also my colleagues in the legislature, we were able to accomplish many of the proposals this last legislative session, but also the advocates, like, right, Chapa, and so many others who were on the forefront with us when we needed them at the State House to fight with us to get these policies done. And I'll just tell you a few of them. The budget. This budget cycle, we included language along about $200,000 to really better align government services and resources with struggling families and individuals, and this was around the Citizens Planner Training Collaborative. We have it. We thought it was important to put more resources in expanding the tools and updating curriculum that would allow local planning boards, ZBAs, and legislators to gain some basic training in planning. Now, I'm from Boston. I'm a Boston girl from Dorchester, and so we have the BRA, right? But there's 351 cities and towns across the Commonwealth, and not everyone has a BRA. So how do we give them the tools so they're able to develop and look ahead and figure out how to do amazing things with properties that they have in their locations? The zoning bill, we did it in the Senate side. Our goal is to really get it done this legislative cycle coming in January. A lot of issues, we're going to have to bring a lot of partners to the table, but one of the big things we talked about was accessory dwelling units. How do we make sure that so they could be built as of right? Allowing would be used for seniors to age in place, allowing families to support college age or post-college age children, and also to help families with physical and intellectual disabilities, where parents may want to keep their families there. How do we do that? So there's a lot of things, that we look forward to work with all of you. We have a lot of work that needs to be done. And I can tell you that we're working with Undersecretary Crystal Cornegay, Secretary Ash, really to focus on housing and look at housing production. And the final piece I'll say is, as we listen to the report today that's being released, it's how do we start shifting the way we talk about different issues in different terms. An example I will give you is I no longer say affordable housing, right? Because you say affordable housing and people think, these people, who are these people? I don't want these people in my community. Well, we need to shift that. And it's really critical. And now I don't say that, and I haven't said that for years. I say we have to create housing that's affordable. We need every city and town in our great Commonwealth to meet the 10% threshold. That is the law on our books. And so how do we help our communities? 10% of the housing stock in 351 cities and towns are supposed to be deemed affordable. And every community is different, we know that. But when we talk about creating housing that's affordable, it's for your parents or your grandparents that are aging out, that want to stay in that great community where they raise their family. It's for your children who graduated college and they're coming back. And they're like, you know what, I remember my childhood. I loved my community and my town. I want to live there. But they can't buy a $500,000 home. So we have to shift the paradigm in the way we speak about it, and making sure that this housing is also for the workforce development and also for low-income earners, so that they don't have to, move away from their community or where their job is located. So we have a lot of work to do. I see Joe Kreisberg from MACDC. Thank you for your work. We know here in the city, CDCs are important, but how do we work collaboratively, regionally, with other communities to make sure that development can happen? So we have work to do, but I know the Boston Foundation is here. Y'all aren't going anywhere. And I know a lot of the folks in this room are continuing to do the work. So I hope that as we have the conversation, as we begin and continue the dialogue, as the legislative session begins in January, that you all show up, that you all bring your ideas, and you bring the conversation to us so we can figure out how is it that we're going to work and make sure that housing is affordable, that we're creating housing for all income levels, low income, middle income professionals. And I see Sheila Dillon, the Chief of Housing for the City of Boston, who's doing a fantastic job. And I'll give you an example of what the city's doing. So we have buildings, right, that may be boarded up, and private owners that boarded up and walked away because they don't live in the city. They own property and they walked away from that building. Well, the city's been able to take over these properties because they haven't paid their taxes. And so Sheila has done an amazing model, because it is about private-public partnerships. How do we get developers in the game? And so it's an amazing model. I went to that property, by the way, on Stoughton Street. Incredible. Sorry. And so it's this property that was boarded up. It was a single family. They turned it into a two-family. Actually, it was a funeral home. That's what it was. And but they put the property out there. The city put nothing in it. They didn't put money into this development, but it was a boarded up property. They did an RFP. They got a small developer, My Time, right, who's developing it, Vietnamese owned, which is wonderful, because again, how do we also get our businesses that are owned by people of color, by women at the table? You don't have to be a big developer to do these projects. So he put the money in. But they restricted it that it had to be a first-time home buyer. And so that property is a two-family house, a homeowner, but there's a rental component, which is going to help to pay the mortgage. So those are the pieces. How do we think creatively? Because there's a lot of boarded-up homes around this great state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, in New Bedford, in Springfield, in Lawrence. So how do we start thinking out of the box? And so we need you as partners to be at the table with us, and look forward to working with you. Hopefully I'm still the chair of housing, right? Hopefully I'm still the chair of housing come January with Kevin, and we look forward to continuing this wonderful work as we help to protect our families and grow and make sure people can stay and thrive in our great Commonwealth. Thank you all, and God bless.
Well, how great is it to have Senator Forry and Chairman Honan as partners in all these endeavors. It's wonderful to have you here, Senator. Thank you very much. I want to remind everyone here today that programs like this and the research that we're presenting has been funded by gifts from the Civic Leadership Fund here at the Boston Foundation and from the Permanent Fund. We thank those of you, and I see many who have made financial contributions to either or both of those funds over the years. That's really what enables us to do things like we are doing this morning. Senator Forry called out Sheila Dillon, so we know Sheila is very much here. I also wanted to point out that Nam Pham, who is Assistant Secretary for the State Department of Housing and Economic Development, is also here this morning. Very, very important to have those senior public officials as part of this program. So let me now introduce Barry, and he's done this so often that he needs no introduction. But I just want to emphasize that from our point of view here at the Boston Foundation, Barry has just been a civic treasure for so many years, and to have someone of his, not only his standing and achievement as a scholar, so committed to being part of developing the answers, whether it's to housing or workforce development or any number of other subjects that he has taken on, often in partnership with the Foundation. So please give a very, very warm welcome to Barry Bluestone.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. What our Senator Forry has done is shown you the passion we need to have behind this, and now we've got to turn that passion into progress. I'm going to go through a lot of slides. You've seen me do this before. I promised Becky I would do this in about 20 minutes. So, but I don't want to start without thanking two of my colleagues who are right over here who are equally responsible for this report, Catherine Tumber and James Usey. Tim Davis is also here, and Tim helped in one of our chapters, so thank you, Tim. So let's go through, I'm going to go through a lot of material, and I'm going to do it quickly. We all know we have a very strong economy. Our colleague Alan Clayton Matthews at the Dukakis Center keeps track of their economy, and we've been growing faster, those are the red bars, than the United States as a whole, with a prospective 3% growth through much of this year. Compared with only about 1.5% or 1.2% U.S.-wide. That's translated into enormous job growth, 338,000 jobs since 2009, an 11% increase in jobs, which of course has led to the lowest unemployment rate in the country, 3.3%. We economists think that is full employment. If we also look at wages, we finally see, after decades of almost no wage growth, we saw some wage growth over the last 2 years here in the Commonwealth. And Greater Boston, the 5 counties that we study very closely, Essex, Middlesex, Norfolk, Plymouth, and Suffolk, have been growing even faster. You'll see here we've had 261,000 jobs added to these 5 counties. That's a 12.1% increase, and Greater Boston now accounts for more than 3/4 of all the job growth in the entire Commonwealth. If we look at household income, unfortunately, while we've seen the wage growth, it has been concentrated in the top end as it is nationwide, but more so here than anywhere else. So actually, between 2009 and 2015, if you look at the bottom 20%, the 20th percentile, they actually saw a decline in their average wage over that period of time. We have a booming economy, and yet wages stagnant. The people in the 80th percentile, I happen to be one of them, some of you are also, maybe many of you, we were the only ones who saw any real increase in our wages. The result is, if we take a look at that, we have seen that there's been very little growth in homeowner income on average, even though the top is doing well. We did something new, and James and Catherine and I decided to take another look at poverty here. I've been looking at poverty since the first poverty threshold in 1964, when Lyndon Johnson declares a war on poverty, and one of his staff says, "How will we know if we're winning?" Because we didn't have poverty lines. And a woman named Molly Orshansky, who I got to know, died last year, put together the first poverty line, and that poverty line has just been adjusted for inflation over the years since then, and it has never been adjusted for differences in cost of living in different areas of the country. So we got into other research, and we find out that Boston, on average, has a 38% higher cost of living than the nation as a whole, led by housing, which is 75% higher. So I said, hey, why don't we adjust the poverty threshold for Greater Boston? And what we found is, when you do that for 4-person families, traditional families, the official poverty rate is 10.6%, the adjusted poverty rate is 16.2%, which says in all of Greater Boston, 1 out of 6 families is poor, right? And if you look at how we compare in the United States with the adjusted poverty line, the U.S. poverty rate is 11.5%. Ours is 16.2. If you look at families with incomes over 150,000, we excel there with twice as many, 26% of our families versus 13. But what it means is that in the United States, 3/4 of the folks are in the middle, but only half, or 60%, 57% here. If we look at all households, not just looking at families, but let's say 2 people living alone or a single person, all that, we now have a 25% poverty rate in Massachusetts with a 3.3% unemployment rate. We also, working with Metropolitan Area Planning Council, have done projections out to 2030. And we suspect that by 2030, in the 5 counties, we'll have about 342,000 more people, continuing the growth that we've had for the last decade. They will be dominated overwhelmingly by people 25 to 44 years old, millennials aging, and seniors like myself, who will be, in my case, celebrating a 72nd birthday 1 month from today. I'm over here, okay? And that's where the demographic is. So we've had a demographic revolution. I last year talked about the 3rd demographic revolution. The first was 1870 to 1920. The city of Boston's population triples from 250,000 to 750,000. We housed them all. They were immigrants from Ireland and Italy and Eastern Europe, and we built the triple deckers. Perfect. And then after World War II, of course, we had a second revolution. Young people coming back, forming families, moving to the suburbs. Boston's population goes from 800,000 to 560. Burlington's, in 20 years, goes up by a factor of 10. Well, now we are on the 3rd demographic revolution. That will be very important for the rest of my story. Okay? And it's where the inner core is where it's growing. That's basically just the kind of Cambridge, Somerville, Boston. That's where a lot of growth is. And then the regional urban centers like Lawrence and Lowell. How do we translate it into households? Well, even with some decline, with very little decline in household size. So we're not seeing, smaller and smaller households. We're going to have 160,000 more households by 2030 than we have today. And a household needs a house, all right? That's 160,000 more units by 2030, all right? And that's a tough nut to crack, okay? So in light of the growing economy and increasing population, the question is there any chance that housing supply will catch up with housing demand? Well, we have some news. Housing sales are rising, although they fell a little bit in October. Since 2011, a 51% increase in home sales. Condo sales are up 55%. Think of the demographics, single-family homes versus condos versus apartments. And we have seen continued sales of triple-deckers and duplexes. 40% of the housing stock in in Cambridge, Somerville, and Boston are triple-deckers or duplexes. They are, as you're going to find in a minute, the best investment you can make. Get out of the stock market, get into triple-deckers, you'll get rich, okay? The cities that lead, the towns that lead in home sales, Brockton, Plymouth, Lynn, Newton, Mr. Mayor. The cities that lead and regions that lead in condo sales are heavily in Boston, South Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, and so forth. Home ownership is down. Nationwide, it's down here. Actually down to about 58.5%, which I found shocking. These are census numbers. And you think, why is that happening? Well, the answer is young people aren't getting into home buying. They're either stuck with a lot of debt or they've delayed getting together and having kids. I am still hoping at some point with a 25-year-old to have a grandchild. I recently, he was home for Thanksgiving, and I took him aside. I said, Josh, I'm going to be 72, right? I don't want to rush you and Rebecca, who's been dating for 5 years, into anything. But could you give me one grandchild at a point where the grandchild is still drooling more than me? So this is... Paul's thinking the same thing. Now, the new housing pipeline. This is the big story, okay? We had been seeing this steady increase in permitting. Now, this is not just Boston. This is all of Greater Boston, 5 counties, about 161 towns and cities. But in 2016... as far as we can tell, based on the first 7 months of the data of this year, it's going to be down below what it was in 2014 by a little bit. So something happened. See those blue lines going up and then the red. And as I said on WBUR this morning on Bob Oakes' show, I'm not sure this is maybe a temporary blip if we're lucky, or is it a new trend? Okay? The other thing that was discouraging is the decline has been in multi-unit housing, precisely the housing we need. In fact, we had an 8.3% increase between 2000 and 2016 in single families, but we've had a 14.5% increase over the last 2 years in multifamily, which doesn't seem right given, the kinds of demographic shifts we have. It also means that we celebrated last year that 5+ unit apartment condos were up to 65% of all new permits, but it was down to about 54% this past year. Who's leading in permitting? Well, Boston, very good, but as Sheila will tell you, at least we've had a temporary lull with about 1,400 fewer permits this year. Cambridge is down, Watertown is down, but we've seen some increases elsewhere. We don't need to worry about that. You'll see that the decline has been heavily in the multifamilies. I'll come back to it in a second and explain what happened. And if you look at actually completed apartments, number of new apartments, we had almost 7,000 last year. Yay, great. In the Boston metro area, we're down, at best, Reese says 4,600 completed this year. Okay? So what that shows us is that we've had an increase in applications. That's really good. DND, particularly in Boston, says that applications are going up. This is City of Boston data. The permits went down, and the units completed went down, and all we can hope for now is those permits will change, those applications will turn into permits real quickly, and they're sped up the permitting process, thanks to Sheila and her gang, and the BRA, and we can hope that the units completed will go back up. But the jury's out on that. Okay? The other thing that's a concern here in Boston is in 1996 to 2003, 39% of the permits were for housing that would be affordable under our old definition of HUD affordable. 25.7% 04 to 2010 and only 18%. What we've been building, as you all know, is luxury housing, and lots of it. So the good news is, as I said, permit times are down, particularly here in the city of Boston. It used to take 472 days to get a permit. For a single-family home, it's down to 74 days. Multifamily for 425 to 119. Student housing, this is real important. I'm at Northeastern University, some of you are at other universities. We have the latest data here, and as of this year, there are 110,000 students living off campus in the greater Boston area. 91% of graduate students are living off campus. And we've got about more than half of our undergraduates. So that's putting tremendous pressure on the market, particularly since most of our universities are not raising their undergraduate levels very much, given demographics, but more and more graduate students. And that's putting pressure as they take over, let's say, the older housing stock, and particularly the triple-deckers, the duplexes, and so forth. Okay? Home prices, I've given a chart here of, we kind of thought about all the things that determine home prices. I'm an economist, so I think about supply, I think about demand, I think about what are those things that raise prices or rents. You know, upward pressure, strong economy, rising household income, population growth, limited supply of new homes. What would put downward pressure on housing prices? Household indebtedness, delayed marriage and childbearing, aging population. Same thing about upward pressure. And then if we really want to do downward pressure, we need an increased supply of housing, and particularly rental housing. Okay? We look at Case-Shiller data. We saw improvements in home prices. But interestingly, we've tracked two cycles, the 88 to 99 cycle. We had a cycle back then, if you remember that. Housing prices fell to about 80% of what they were. But then they came back, and after 124 months, 127 months, in the old cycle, they were 20% higher than they were in the old peak. Now, across the whole greater Boston area, they're only 2% higher. Again, it's demographics. We've got a lot of people my age who are starting to think about selling the old single-family home, moving somewhere else. And so we're going to have probably enough larger single-family homes. We need different kinds of housing for a different demographic. Our vacancy rates remain very low. We should have about a 2% vacancy rate in single-family homes to stabilize prices. We're at now only 1%, half of what it should be, which is well below the nation of 1.6 right now. As a result, the annual median price of single-family homes since 2009 is up to about $425,000, a 26% increase since 2009, when the economy started to recover. Condo sales prices are up even further, although they fell a little bit this year, as a result perhaps of this building, up 40%. And if we look at the inner core, Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, go back here, you'll see that the single-family home prices that have now exceeded the 2005 peak are all in the inner core. We still have areas outside the inner core where prices are still lower than they were in 2005. For single families, although we have communities that have just exploded. I happen to live in Cambridge. I married into it 30 years ago. My wife has made me a millionaire. Since 2005, the average price of a single-family home in Cambridge has gone up by 2.4 times. The average price in the whole greater Boston area has gone up by 2%. Okay? And Brookline, Somerville, Newton, and so forth. But we still have communities that haven't gotten back to where they were in '05. So big difference. So we have this diverging prices of single-family homes and condos, and it reflects this incredible divergence in our income distribution. Okay, let's just go on here. Now, what rose the fastest? What rose the fastest in price were triple-decker units. They now, a single unit, not the whole building. The median price is now $500,000. So you take a triple-decker, that's a $1.5 million building, right? It was built for $38,000 in 1918, okay? And that's been going up, and the question is why? Why are these prices going up by 100%, single-family prices up by 1/5 that much? The answer is, we've got all these graduate students. We've got all these interns. We've got all these residents. We've got all kinds of young professionals who are coming here. They're doubling, tripling up, And the result is they're taking over that housing stock, and it's the most lucrative investment that anybody has. I actually have some friends who've bought triple-deckers, and they're doing very well on that, right? But that was the housing stock that served working families for so long, and they're being priced out of it by the demographic revolution, okay? So what's happened to rents? Well, vacancy rate is still down at 3.4%, the lowest since 2001. Don't have enough to keep the vacancy rate up. Average effective rents for the greater Boston area are up 31% since 2009. And if we look at the inner core, Boston, Somerville, Cambridge, they're up by 59% to almost $3,000. Now, here's a way to think about $3,000. That's for 1 month. Multiply $2,957 by 12 months, and you're talking $35,500. Remember those 25% of families, or 16% of families that are below the poverty line? That poverty threshold is $32,000. So somebody at the poverty threshold in Greater Boston has to pay $3,000 more than their entire income to pay for the median rent in Greater Boston. Let that sink in. Okay? And so what you see here is that since 2009, single-family prices up by about 26%, condo prices up by 40%, apartments across the whole Greater Boston up 31%, but a 59% increase in the inner core. Okay? What has that meant? More and more people are what we call cost burdened. From 39.2% of renter households paying more than 30% of their income in rent to 50%, household homeowners the same. So we've seen a rise in foreclosures. I think part of that is some people aren't benefiting from this economy, and more of the banks are finally getting through both petitions and deeds. We've looked at subsidized housing, and Kathy Tumber led a whole chapter in this report on housing. Of all the total housing units that are in HUD programs of one kind or another, they average less than 7%, except in Suffolk County where they're 17%. 63% of the households in subsidized HUD housing are 51 years or older. About 30% include children. And housing choice vouchers, project-based Section 8, and public housing are the key ways that people live in subsidized housing. If we look at persons living in poverty that are not served by HUD housing, it's more than half in Essex, Middlesex, Norfolk, and Plymouth County, and it's almost a third. These are people living in poverty according to the official poverty line, not the adjusted one, who have not been able to get housing. And part of the reason is the waiting lists are so long. In Essex County, it takes more than 4 years after application for a HUD housing program, a voucher or public housing. In Suffolk, it's much better, 2 years. Okay? We also know that we've had a 25% increase in homeless family placements. We've been doing very well with homeless singles, but families with children, we have a lot of work to do. We have longer and longer stays in shelters and motels when we've tried to do just the opposite to reduce that. And the other thing, particularly in Kathy's work, is she actually plotted out with James's work on mapping that when we do place people in subsidized housing, we're placing them into the same disadvantaged poor communities where they're raising their kids. And one of the things we know from a lot of social science research is you got to get people into better neighborhoods in order to improve the opportunity of their children. So we have a lot of poor families. Finally, and I'm almost done, I think both the Commonwealth and the City of Boston have long targeted affordable housing, housing that is affordable, as both a critical ethical matter and as an economic necessity. We've had some luck in terms of inclusionary zoning. Of all the new units in which inclusionary zoning works, about 11% of those units are affordable, but 2,200 out of 20,000, right? Remember, our goal is 53,000 units of all kinds in the city. And 96% of those inclusionary zoning units are kind of a middle income greater than 60% of AMI. We've seen some continued growth in the number of units produced under Chapter 40B, the 1969 zoning law, but the number of 40B permits has continued to fall to just 9 in 2016. and a continuing decline in new Chapter 40B production from over 4,000 units in 2005. We estimate right now by the end of December, we'll only have less than 820 or so. All right, so 40B worked really well. It's not working as well as it used to. 40R, something that Ted Carman and Eleanor White helped write, has continued to give us more units. We now have 3,354 completed units and about 12,000 that could ultimately be permitted. And there's been public funding. Tim Davis pulled these numbers together for us. Basically, overall, it's been flat when you include Commonwealth's real operating funds for housing. There's been an increase for housing programs and kind of a decline in the total amount of money for homelessness. So we basically have about $430 million in housing programs. The federal government, we had a lot of funding during ARRA, during the Recovery Act. It's been going up again through 2016. I understand there's a new administration coming in on January 20th. We'll see what they do with this number. If you look at total real spending by DHCD, Department of Community and Housing Development, it started rising in 2013, and it has continued to rise. So we've had an 18% increase. That's part of the effort that's going forth. That's all good, right? We've also had some new policies. The Baker-Polito administration has added $31 million for low-income tax credits, $218 million in equity. The administration was going to award more than $59 million in federal home funds and state capital funds, and a 5-year capital plan that includes $1.1 billion commitment over 5 years for increased housing production. That's all good. And the Senate, under Senator Forry's leadership, passed a far-ranging zoning reform bill. The problem is we haven't gotten it through the House, so we got to work on the House side, right?
We're going to work together.
We're going to work together. I've heard that from somewhere. The city of Boston, of course, set a goal of 53,000 housing units. City land has been made available to developers. Senator Forry mentioned some of that. A new Office of Housing Stability, a new workforce housing tax credit has been proposed. We got to get state support for that. Local home rule, and a significant reduction in permit wait times that I talked about. All that's good. But here's the problem. Even if we do all those things, we don't come close to hitting 160,000. Okay? So, what do we need? Richard Ortner, who is the president of the Boston Conservatory, is here. He's been working with other conservatory presidents to build an artist village. Smaller units. Tamara Roy is here. She's been designing what those units might look like. We've got Mass Challenge. Scott Bailey is talking about a startup village in Dry Dock Avenue. We're trying to work with Mass Port to do that. We've got new models for microhousing, including, I hope Tamara will say something about the Yoo-Hoo, which is going to be on display for the rest of this year. And we've got some possibility of actually developing a manufacturing facility here to build panelized or modular units. And the way I've been thinking about it is, wouldn't it be great if we weren't not just the leader in biotech, not just the leader in higher education and medical care, but we became the innovators with all the brilliance we have in this city to build a whole kind of new housing that would not only house our people, could house people all over the country. We could be a manufacturing hub for housing. Right now, we have panelized housing coming in. It's built in Pennsylvania. It's built in Canada. Let's build it here. And by the way, let's train some kids through Madison Park High to learn the trades to do that and get some of our construction trades to help do the teaching, right? And I think we can do all that. Thank you very much. One last quick note, and I just checked it again. Did any of you see the Saturday Night Live right after the election with Kate McKinnon at the piano singing Hallelujah? Remember, she turns to the audience and she says, "I'm not going to quit. You shouldn't either." Thank you.
All right, thank you, Barry, for getting through that so quickly. My name is Becky Kepnick. I am the Director of Neighborhoods and Housing here at the Boston Foundation. I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel discussion. So as our panelists are getting settled, I'm going to do very brief overviews of them. You have bios in your packet, and we're just going to jump right into questions. So we have plenty of time for the panel to talk and then for you to ask questions at the end. All right, so why don't we get started? So first, sitting to my right, your left, we have Rob May, who is the Director of the Department of Planning and Economic Development for the City of Brockton. Next to him, we have Paul Grogan, President of the Boston Foundation and my boss, so everyone please be kind today during this panel discussion. This is a test. Next to Paul, we have Mayor Seti Warren, Mayor of Newton. Thank you for joining us, Mayor. Next to the mayor, we have Rachel Heller, the new Executive Director of the Citizens Housing and Planning Association. Welcome, Rachel. And finally, last but not least, we have Peter Foreman, who is the President and CEO of the South Shore Chamber of Commerce, and we're so happy you were able to make it here today. Thank you so much. So we're going to just jump right into questions. So one finding from the report, which Barry highlighted, is that the number of permits for new housing dropped by almost 20% in 2016, driven by reductions in some of the core urban communities. Now, as Barry said, unclear if this is a long-term trend or a blip, but I wanted to turn to our panelists and starting with Mayor Warren, ask if this is the start of a long-term trend, do you think some of the communities outside of the inner core can fill the gap here? And what does your experience working at the local level tell you about the possibility of communities a little further out picking up some of the slack?
Thank you for the question. And Barry, excellent presentation. And so two quick things on the permitting. First I want to answer the question directly about permits, but I want to refer back to some of the work that Barry's done very briefly. Barry, full disclosure, worked with the City of Newton about 4 years ago to really understand what our data and demographics are. Who are the people that are living in Newton right now? Are they able to be self-sustaining in Newton at all ages? And then projecting out what Newton would look like in the next 10 to 20 years. And we discovered some things that were quite startling. And this goes into the larger issue of what the economy looks like today and the changes that are happening in places like Newton today. Number one, as Barry pointed out, we have an aging population in the city of Newton, including all across the Commonwealth as well. Number two, what we don't have is adequate infrastructure to support people that are younger and people that are of middle and lower income in places like Newton. And third, we have to look at this comprehensively. So there's two things I want to say. Number one, we know with the changing economy, there are two issues at play. Number one, as Barry pointed out, people's wages are not going up. And they haven't. Average people at the top levels, wages are going up. People at the median level and bottom level, those wages aren't going up. So we have to deal with that so that people can, in the 21st century economy, be able to afford to live in places like Newton with raising their income levels and their wealth. And there are lots of ways to do that. Number two, there are cost drivers. Housing is a number one cost driver, but we also have to include transportation, which is a huge cost driver and is very inaccessible, and even in places like Newton for middle and lower income people, and energy costs and daycare. Believe it or not, those are three of the cost drivers that prevent people from being self-sustaining in places like Newton and all over the Commonwealth. So we have to make it a concerted effort at an early point to raise people's income levels at the local level if we can, with education outside of the classroom, inside. We have to, number two, look at ways as people are aging in place, people will be able to afford to stay in Newton. And number three, begin to reduce the housing costs. So on the permitting side, I do see an alarming trend. And it's been happening coming out of the Great Recession and in other communities where higher market units are being produced in and around our region. They're desired by developers, whereas middle income and lower income units are not. We would like to have a comprehensive approach. We have a comprehensive approach in Newton. After taking Barry's data and looking at it comprehensively, we've interwoven the idea that we'd empower people with affordable units, empower people with affordable and accessible transportation, as well as the tools to be able to stay in place. We have changed in the city of Newton, for example. We're looking at growing accessory apartments by right. It's in the Senate bill right now. We have an ordinance to change it in Newton now. We have over 80 places we'd like to see development happen that are connected to transportation infrastructure that makes sense. In the short term, we'd like to produce close to 900 units in the next 5 years to hit our 10%. We have specific places where we'd like to do that. And we'd also like to weave in social services that we're bringing together to support people of middle and lower income as well. So we are making a concerted effort, but I'm making a pitch to everyone in the audience that we have to look at this comprehensively and not in silos if we're going to hit things like the 10% and make sure people are self-sustaining.
Great. Rob, I wonder if you'd like to weigh in on this question as well, and then Peter.
Yes, my answer is should the communities outside of the center be picking up the slack, or could they? And the answer is yes, they can. But again, what Mayor Warren had said, should some of these communities be picking up the slack? As we look at where the permitting is being done right now, we're seeing a lot of growth in communities that don't have access to jobs and don't have access to transportation. And that's going to become critical as we continue to grow. I think, from the Commonwealth's perspective, we really need to look at how do we incentivize not just the urban core, but also along the transit lines to make sure that we have units in those areas so that people can get to jobs, not necessarily on the roads, and be very strategic about how we advance.
So I think this data necessarily looks at some communities along political jurisdictions. I look at Boston more as an economic area, and that economic bubble is expanding. Not a bubble is going to burst, but the Boston economy is much larger than Boston. It is spreading out. For some of us, the idea that housing permitting may be slowing down in Boston is a good thing, because that helps us with our strategy of being some of the safety valve for housing for the Boston market. We're building a lot of housing on the South Shore. A lot of it is transit development, large projects. It is not affordable housing based on where it is located. It is affordable housing for Boston. So we're seeing that growth. We're trying to use some of that housing development not as a housing issue as much as an economic driver in order to bring younger people down into the South Shore. So if Boston is slowing down its permitting, that's wonderful. We'll pick up some of the slack on the South Shore, and then our challenge is how do we build an economy around that?
That's great. So in this same vein, back in 2014, 301 of the 351 municipalities in Massachusetts did not permit a single unit of multifamily housing. But in this report, we see that the number of municipalities not permitting multifamily housing is down to 114. So there is development happening a little more spread out. And this question is for Rachel. Are you seeing this shift in your work at CHAPA? Is this what your members are talking about? And how is this playing out?
We're seeing the opposite, that multifamily zoning continues to be the biggest barrier for housing development, and the lack of zoning, the resistance to building this kind of housing. And we really need to zone more for it and tie that zoning to the needs of each region. Like you're talking about, where are the jobs, where do we need to see more housing, and what kind of housing is it that people are looking for? In Barry's data, we saw an increase in single-family homes. More and more people want to live in denser developments and walkable communities, near transportation, near jobs, near amenities, and that is where we really need to focus our efforts. We're getting the smart growth housing that we need. It's meeting the demand. MAPC tells us that we need 17,000 new homes every year between now and 2040, and 2/3 of that needs to be multifamily housing. So we do not currently, from what I'm hearing, have the zoning that we need to meet our housing goals.
Paul, I wonder if you could jump in here as someone who's worked in housing in and around Boston for a number of years. Do these?
We don't have to say how long.
Yeah, no. I won't. But are you hearing echoes of conversations in the past in this conversation today? And can you sort of contextualize us where we are in terms of past concerns about housing protection, zoning, and the like?
Well, first of all, let me admit I'm a little disoriented sitting up here. I'm usually the one asking the questions, but I'll do my best. Well, I have been at this a while. I joined the Kevin White administration in 1975, and it's getting harder and harder to remember what kind of terrible shape the city was in those days. Hemorrhaging people, as Barry pointed out, going from 800,000 down to 5-some, hemorrhaging people and jobs to the suburbs. What are now some quite pricey neighborhoods were marked by extensive blight and housing abandonment. In fact, that's how we were providing affordable housing in that era, by allowing the city to decline and housing to deteriorate, but it became more affordable. I think we all can agree that that's not the strategy we wanted, and there's an awful lot of good news here in terms of what the renaissance of Boston has meant. It's just extraordinary to have this vital city that brings so much good with it. So I think though the problems we're dissecting today are very real and serious, let me tell you, I'd rather have these problems than where we were a generation ago when the very existence of cities was being questioned, and Kevin White couldn't raise any local financing for the renovation of Faneuil Hall Marketplace from local financial institutions. They were so pessimistic. I'd rather be where we are today, and we've got to remember that there's no such thing as permanent success or permanent failure for cities. We need only think about Detroit, which had the highest per capita income of any city in the United States in the 60s, and Boston was in free fall, declining very rapidly, and that situation almost completely reversed in not that long a time. So we really have to attack this problem, and I agree with the mayor that you got to look very heavily at the underlying economic dynamics. This housing is very much a creature of the economic situation where we've built this marvelous economy, but that places a huge emphasis on educational attainment, which if you don't have, you are harshly punished. And so we're all familiar with the numbers of the jobs that people can't fill, can't find people for, and the people who don't have jobs. And so there's got to be renewed effort there that's got to, as we're doing in Boston, aggressively raise college completion rates particularly for minorities and immigrant children. We've got to ask more of our community colleges that they really forge the kinds of relationships that some have done with regional employers that leads to internships and almost guaranteed employment with those relationships. So a big part of this is attacking that economic gap. On the housing side, though, I think what really struck me about Barry's report is there's a lot going on. I mean, we're not a community that needs to be awakened to this. Far from it. There's a lot happening as he went through. But isn't it distressing that he says in the next sentence, we're not even close. We're not on track to moderating the most ill effects of this housing shortage or housing appreciation. So we can't, as the overused saying goes, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We've got to take this up another level. And I really believe the governor and the political and civic leadership of Eastern Massachusetts have to really come together and absorb this message that we are not on track to get there, and there are going to be very serious consequences of being not on track for decades, and we've got to do some things differently. And we also have to worry, and an allusion was made to the change in administrations. A group of us who were very involved in getting the low-income housing tax credit enacted back in the mid-'80s, celebrated the 30th anniversary of that in an event in Washington. It's been extensively used here. It's critical to what affordable housing efforts can be here. Well, there's going to be a tax bill, and by definition, that puts everything that's now in place in some kind of jeopardy. And so we've got to also look to defend the few public sector investments that are so directly aimed at the most crucial issue, which is the shortage of multifamily housing.
Thank you, Paul. So shifting a little bit, as we have been sort of in the political area, the Boston Foundation recently completed a poll of attitudes towards housing in Eastern Massachusetts. And we found that majorities across all regions and demographics strongly agreed that housing was either becoming unaffordable, they strongly agreed or somewhat agreed that housing was becoming unaffordable. 86% of folks thought this was a significant issue. But then, when you ask folks, do you actually support more housing development, there's actually significant support, even for rental housing, among homeowners, who generally tend to be the least supportive of housing. 53% support additional rental housing in their community, and 54% support denser, transit-oriented housing in their community. So thinking about sort of the politics of the situation, I wanted to ask, starting with Peter and then Mayor Warren and Rob and Rachel, does this resonate with your experience? Are these numbers surprising to you? And how are folks in your community primed or not for additional housing to be developed?
They're a little surprising that people would support more housing, particularly in the suburbs. And my guess is the polling probably did not go deep enough to distinguish between more housing and more housing for people who might have kids and add to the school budget. We're concerned about affordable housing for our grown children. We're not real anxious, particularly in the suburbs, to see housing for other people's kids if they are going to have children. It is one of the great birth control methods that we have in Massachusetts, zoning and housing.
I think that's the first time at a housing report card forum we've gone down this direction. All right, let's keep going.
I used to represent Plymouth during the 80s when we had all of the urban flight. There's massive growth in the suburbs and great opposition because of the impact on school budget and what that would do to the cost of housing because of property taxes. And I don't think that's been untangled yet. So there is lots of support for denser housing if it's over 55 housing, if it's assisted living housing, if it's transit development housing, because the theory is that people will get back on the trains and leave at some point if they have kids. But it is still a big concern about how you deal with, as the mayor said on the infrastructure, how do you deal with school budgets and accepting more family development?
Mr.
Rachel, could I just, Peter, you just gave me a great idea that I shared with the senator, and it seems to me, given what you just said about birth control, that this may be a way we could get the entire Catholic Church on our side on zoning.
So, Rachel, I'm going to throw that over to you.
I am a little biased, but I think children are good. Children are good for communities. And, you know, the numbers don't surprise me. I think in Massachusetts we do care so much about other people, and we do have, you know, great programs that we've created, you know, the Mass Rental Voucher Program, our own state public housing. But when it comes to where that housing actually is, you're right, the first concern is always, the first thing we always hear is school costs. And I think that, you know, I'm being a little facetious, but really families are good for communities, and we need to embrace families. We can't only have aging communities. The communities cannot survive if that's the case. So we need to figure out how to pay for costs, but also recognize the benefits that families are bringing to communities and people of different backgrounds. We have diversity in our communities. That's a good thing. So we have to get past those barriers. And I think the state can help, you know, creating some more tools and helping communities to plan. We do have the Chapter 40S program, which reimburses school costs that increase as a result of the 40R smart growth developments. We should look at expanding that with multifamily development. But again, children are good.
As the mother of the 3.5-year-old twins, I'm not, I'm halfway there. Go ahead, Rob.
If I could paraphrase Tip O'Neill, all housing, all development is local. You know, we want to sound like we care. There's a lot of people, I'm sorry, that want to sound like they care. And yes, we're all concerned about housing, just not here. And so how does it affect my life? We've just expanded our 40R district in downtown, around downtown Brockton, and that was a tremendous fight. Even within, you know, the city council and, you know, some area residents, oh my God, you're destroying the city, and and how could you do this, and we don't need housing downtown. So while we look at the numbers and we see, you know, from Barry's report, and I'm sorry the charts are not up there, but we need more housing units, we just don't need them next to me. And we have to get past that stigma that housing density is a bad thing, that mixed incomes is a bad thing, that having seniors and millennials and families with children doesn't work in our community. And I don't know quite how to get through that, but I'm sure there's thousands of planners looking at that issue right now. But it's going to take strong political leadership, which is where I fling this over to.
Can I jump in on this one?
Yeah.
So there's two things I want to say. First of all, it is extremely difficult to build housing, diverse housing in communities like Newton. I've been at this for several years, and I think there are two things at play. I want to talk about Newton in particular, and then I want to talk a little broader. So change is hard for people. There are some people in Newton that are doing extremely well, a lot of people in Newton. In fact, Newton has the second highest number of millionaires in the state of Massachusetts, second to Boston. There's great wealth in Newton, but there are also, as we've learned through Barry's research and some additional research that we've done, some economically distressed people in Newton that are not necessarily in poverty, but that are living in our city, trying to pay for food, trying to pay for energy, trying to pay for after-school activities, trying to age in place. And there are folks in poverty. So I think, number one, there are some folks in Newton, when we think about transit-oriented development, when they are presented with projects like the one we just passed in Newtonville, transit-oriented development in Newtonville near the commuter rail and bus stop. Very difficult conversation. In Newton, the city council passes all special permits and zoning changes, and we've been in reactive mode for many years. But we got this project, this mixed-use development, passed several months ago. It was a very difficult conversation, passed by 1 or 2 votes. And I lobbied pretty hard for that myself, and there are people in this audience that as well. I'm looking at some of my friends here. And part of that conversation was, is Newton going to change for the worse for the folks that moved there, that purchased a home there? Is somehow are their property values going to go down because there are more people in the schools? Those folks will move into the community and sort of disturb their assets. So that's one group. The second group of folks that are economically distressed in the city of Newton, that are sending their kids to public schools, that are trying to get through our traffic, which traffic is really bad in this region because we don't have adequate, good, solid public transportation, which we need to do. But there's a lot of folks that are economically distressed that said this development is not going to be helpful to me either. So you had this clash of folks that were doing well and folks that aren't doing well. And so what we tried to explain to people during that conversation was, number one, Newton is changing already. The region's changing already, right? Our city centers are attracting, and we have 6 city centers, we have 13 villages, are attracting shops, are attracting businesses that can afford to move in, so larger corporate entities. And I don't want to beat up the banks, but they're able to afford to be in these village centers where people used to shop. They used to get things in their village neighborhoods, amenities and things like that. So number two, their children, folks that are wealthy and folks that aren't so wealthy, right now, if Newton continues the way it's going, and it's changing now, aren't going to be able to afford to not only own in Newton, but rent in Newton. And I always do this when I always say to folks, raise your hand if you're concerned that your children aren't going to be able to live in the city where you grew up. Raise your hands if you're worried about your aging parent being able to stay there. And everyone raises their hands. Raise your hand if you're concerned that your teacher or your police officer or your firefighter are unable to live in the community where they serve. Buy a home. Everyone raise their hand. So we get into this dialogue about the fact that Newton is changing now. If we actually produce more transit-oriented development, density in places that make sense, right? we can actually retain what's best about communities like Newton. We're not talking about building over open spaces, parks. We need all those. We can make our city walkable and bikeable. But that goes into a larger question, and I'll end with this. One of the things that I think comprehensively we must do, I also chair U.S. Conference of Mayors Housing Community Development Committee nationally for the last several years. State and federal partners need to get together with cities again and make investments in 3 areas. Investments in people, Paul touched upon this, growing opportunity for people to raise their income levels, whether it's through education, minimum wage, other types of protections. Because the economy has changed, some people are not able to work anymore, our aging population, people with disabilities. We need a safety net that's there so people can be empowered. Number 2, infrastructure, housing and transportation. Number 3, growing jobs where people live. And I think we need to get better and smarter about attracting the types of incubators, not only for tech, but different types of businesses so that people can earn higher wages where they live. The state government has a responsibility to do that. I love this zoning bill that my colleague, Senator Forry, has talked about. We also need to make investments to subsidize housing for communities that want to build it. I think at the federal level, we need to increase things like community development block grants. They've been slashed in the last 10 years that frankly go towards all 3 different areas that we talked about. There's a great program called Jobs Plus with HUD. That incorporates this idea of hard bricks and mortar housing and supplemented by wraparound services. We got to get smart about that, where people live. And so we need real and then finally on education. I just want to, and I'll end there. I'll get off my soapbox here. The federal and state government need to get serious about education. You mentioned education because people bring up education when they think about development and housing. The fact is, children and families are good for communities, right? It's really good and healthy for children and families to be able to afford to live in communities, contribute to the economy, go buy things at the local merchants, support that economy, support a strong middle class. There needs to be, and I know Senator Forry, I keep pointing over at you, another look at the funding formula for local education. We have got to, all these competing interests, we always set up government where we're competing education against housing, if that's transportation. It needs to be looked upon comprehensively, and there need to be investments made so that we're not talking about, well, if you build, I just proposed a 27, we're supporting a 27-acre development in Newton and Needham. We'll build 900 units in the city of Newton. Northland has proposed it. I'm supporting it. The first thing people are saying, well, schools, we've got to build schools. Newton's very fortunate because we have some extra space, in our classrooms. But at the end of the day, that question needs to be answered in a real way, and it can't just the cities just can't be burdened with answering that question. There needs to be a partnership in creating the space, teachers, and all the rest that complements the housing so that children and families can move in. I'll stop there. I could go.
So we're going to shift for a minute away from some of the local conversations that we've been having, talk a little bit about the federal level, but I do want to add just as a point of interest, in the poll that we did, we asked if increased school funding would impact an individual's support for additional housing development, and it only moved the numbers in terms of support by 2 to 4 percentage points. So clearly there are a lot of issues at work here, let's say. But shifting again more to the federal level, we've been talking about local support for affordable housing, but that doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are federal fair housing laws and rules that have recently come out that play a role in shaping when and how housing is meant to be built. And I wanted to ask Rachel, have you seen some of these federal rules really changing how local communities are planning and thinking for their future growth?
I would say not yet. And I hope that our federal government will still have the sort of emphasis on fair housing and the kinds of tools that can help communities to create more housing opportunities. Like Paul mentioned, the low-income housing tax credit, Section 8, home fund, CDBG. We don't know what the future is for these programs right now. And so every community does need to be more welcoming and more inclusive, and we need to create more opportunities. We also need to make sure that those resources continue to exist at the federal level so that communities have the tools, developers have the tools they need to create the housing we need.
I do want to say that there are new rules out there, although God knows what's going to happen on January 21st. But there's a new fair housing rule that has gotten much more prescriptive, I would say, in how communities assess fair housing. And we're going through the assessment right now. And then how that affects your CDBG annual action plan and comprehensive plan, or consolidated plan.
Brockton's one of the first ones due.
Yeah,
right?
we're
So
one of the
early
first
next year.
ones through the meat grinder. Yay. So we think that that's going to have a big impact on how we spend our CDBG funds. And so that might be a mixed blessing as we look at how all these other programs and things that we do, we have to show that they are supporting fair housing activities. So investing in communities that are high concentrations of poverty or minority or language barrier communities, how we enforce workforce development, how we work on small business development. I think all of these programs are going to be affected by that, this fair housing rule.
Anybody else want to jump in? I thought okay. So shifting again to a question for Paul, one of the findings in the report that really jumped at me and that Barry highlighted was the sort of adjusting the poverty level to account for the housing costs in the Massachusetts region that put our poverty level higher than that of the national average. I wondered, Paul, if you could offer some observations on, did this surprise you, and how does that lead you to think about our work here at the Boston Foundation?
Well, I was very concerned to see that, and not really surprised. All of us are experiencing, the difference here in terms of cost of living. But I'm actually very hopeful that this new statistic will galvanize further attention to this issue. I mean, it's embarrassing for a city and a region that is this prosperous. Roaring economies, the life sciences and the technology sectors are booming. It's embarrassing that if it's the case that a quarter of the population or something appropriate, something close to that is living in poverty. And it also underscores the point that the mayor made, I tried to make as well, that the economic dimension of the housing crisis. We've got to go after this economic divide in an equally comprehensive way that we're talking about going after the housing problem. So I'm actually hopeful that the reality of this new calculation at the poverty level will help us all convince more people that something has to be done here.
I was just really appreciative of this being included in the report and emailed Barry about this, because I think that this story doesn't get told of how much affordable housing we really still need and how much people are struggling to afford housing. We have increasing numbers of households that are paying more than 30% or 50% of their income towards rent. And at the same time, while we're increasing the minimum wage, that's a great thing. We need to change our other programs so that they accommodate this increase in a wage, because we want to make sure that people are actually better off for earning more money. And right now there's a disconnect between all of the different things that people need. You mentioned childcare, all of these things. People need housing is the base, and then upon that, people need to be able to have safe places to send their kids every day to school. And for so many families that are struggling to access these different programs at the state and federal level, the programs don't all work really well together, and we need to figure out how to make them work together. And I think acknowledging that we have this huge number of people that can't afford to live here helps us. Shining a light on that, we can start to get to some of the solutions.
I was going to say, Barry, I think the new number, the new calculation is very illuminating and scary in a way that we have such a crisis. But as the last election taught us, we can't afford to miss the middle. And that came back to bite somebody on the butt big time. Sorry, I'm mic'd. Billy Bush, are you out there? But I'm really encouraged to see the mass housings program for workforce housing which is a 80 to 120% AMI. And I think that that's going to be a great product, and hopefully we'll be in on that in the first round. We're working with a couple of developers right now that are looking at the product, but I think that that's a great opportunity to cement that into our communities.
Can I jump in on that one too?
Go ahead.
Sorry.
I thought that would spark that.
I do think everybody at every income level needs help right now. There are very few people who can comfortably go and purchase a home or afford rent. But I think one of the keys to getting at the group in the middle is for us to build more housing, and it goes back again to zoning. We're not zoning for the amount of housing that we need and the types of housing that we need, and that is, we're creating the shortage, and we are trying to make up for years of not building the housing that we need. And so the middle is where we're really feeling it. We have to create these new programs. So I'm thankful that the programs exist because people do need help. But we've got to build the housing, then we wouldn't need to create so many programs to help this group as well. Like, the market could actually help them if we let the market be the market. And it's very rare for me to say things like, let the market be the market.
Everyone start tweeting. Great. So we're going to go to our final question, then we'll open it up for Q&A. Barry.
I just wanted to add something that Rob said. So here we finished this report before the recent election. Sorry. We finished this report before the recent election, and as soon as the election results came in, we were fairly shocked. I think many of you in the room were shocked by it. And I thought, why am I wasting my time doing a housing report?
Hey.
Hey, we got a national problem that may be bigger. But Rob brought up something that's really important. I thought about it. 1,083,000 citizens of Massachusetts voted for Donald Trump. Let me say that again. 1,083,000 people, voters, voted for Donald Trump in this election. Some of them are real bigots. Most of them are not. Most of them think government doesn't work for them. Most of them are suffering, and they haven't seen their incomes rise. And I think what I realize now in terms of the housing report card is I'm actually proud of the fact that we're tackling this, because this is not only going to solve an ethical issue and an economic issue, it's programs like we're talking about here that could ultimately also solve the political crisis we have here. I did a big speech earlier this year in our open classroom that Paul and I started way back in 2008 at Northeastern, and this year it's on policy advice to the president. And I started out by saying, I wrote a book called The Deindustrialization of America with my dear late colleague Ben Harrison in 1982. Talked about deindustrialization, the loss of manufacturing. I grew up in Detroit, he grew up in Jersey City. And then we followed 6 years later with the first book on inequality called The Great U-Turn, Corporate Restructuring and the Polarizing of America. And I started out by saying how proud I was that we had the knowledge, the foresight to think about the economic implications of this. And then I followed up by saying, I only wish I weren't so stupid and moronic that I didn't understand what the political implications would be. So to the extent that we can work hard on the issues right here at home that the Boston Foundation has been working on for over 100 years, will not only help us economically and ethically, it may be exactly what we need to turn this country around from the dangerous track it's on now.
Oh, there. So that's a good segue to our final question, which is that, partnership at the local level between cities, towns, and the state is going to become even more critical over the next 4 years for folks who care about these issues. And I wanted to give each of the panelists an opportunity to share some recommendations that you would have for policymakers at the state level in your own community and others about what needs to happen next as a community to address some of the housing issues that we've discussed here today. And I'll start with Rachel.
I think there's so much that needs to be done. I've got a long list, Senator Forry. She's used to hearing it. But the first thing, obviously, we need communities to plan more for more housing. We need to help communities have the tools to do that so that they can control development and not control it, but plan for development rather than having development happen to them. So whether it's the comprehensive zoning reform bill, multifamily zoning requirements, and then also providing the tools that we need to create housing. Boston just passed CPA. That is incredible. More communities are in. We need to make sure that the funding, strong funding is there for a strong state match so we can really maximize this. Rental subsidies so we can make sure that we have we can provide housing for all of these families that are struggling, that are at this new adjusted poverty level, and everybody who's struggling. These are the kinds of things that we need in place. And then I think all of us in this room have so much power that we don't even realize. We should all be speaking up in our own communities. This is tremendous because the naysayers, the people who don't want to see more housing, are very loud. But we are not always very loud. And if everybody just thought about speaking up in their own communities, it's amazing how the conversation changes. So I beg you to please speak up and support. I'm doing it in mine. I hope that you'll do it in yours.
Thank you. Peter, do you want to?
So I think a few suggestions would be to look at housing as an economic strategy more than at face value just a housing strategy. I would focus, if you're thinking about economic development, think about it more regionally than locally, municipality by municipality, because you run into the opposition you get of New England home rule, which is very strong. And third, I would guard against the prevailing paradigms of housing solutions, which right now are focused on reurbanization, smart growth, maybe gateway cities. In the suburbs, where we're trying to do a lot of work through the South Shore Chamber on economic development, one of the challenges we're going to have is there is so much focus on this thinking that everybody wants to move back to the city. They're not going to come back out to the suburbs. We think the suburbs can reinforce the good growth that is happening in the cities. But we're likely to run into some obstacles because what's dominating the housing discussion is the reurbanization and just millennials wanting to live in those cities and how we deal with that. And I think there has to be broader philosophies.
Mayor Warren?
I think updating our thinking from 20th century strategy and ensuring people are self-sufficient to 21st century strategy, realizing the change of the economy. Income inequality is the issue of our time. We know that. And in order to address income inequality, we have to make sure that people can be upwardly mobile. And we also have to make sure those that don't have the ability to take care of themselves have an opportunity to be self-sustaining in our community. So it calls for new thinking. I think, number one, at the city level, Newton, for the first time, has a proactive, comprehensive plan around investment in people and education, infrastructure, including transportation, housing, and growing jobs where we live regionally, and I agree with the regional approach. But I think that beyond Newton, I think every region should have the toolkit to do it. I'm really heartened to hear Senator Forry saying you're going to give cities and towns the tools to do it. We hired consultants to help us produce this in Newton. Second, I want to echo my call for state and federal involvement, getting out of the silos, not doing things the way we've done it, but looking at it comprehensively, trying new things and measuring them, and being bold. Now is not the time for incrementalism. I mean, Barry just laid out 160,000 units we've got to build. It means we have to be bold about putting some solutions out there that maybe you haven't seen. And I'm not telling you I have all the solutions. There's no magic bullet out there. But I think we have to be aggressive and bold and get that commitment from state and federal partners. And finally, at the local level, these conversations are really hard. There are folks on all sides in my community that have different ideas about how to do this. We need to continually, as Barry said, try to get perspective between one another and work on how to make the community better as a whole. It's really easy to say. It sounds like a platitude, but we've got to continue to work on it. I have to continue to work on it as well.
Thank you. Paul?
Three quick points. One is we have to be sure that the tools we've already created are being used to their fullest potential. I was startled at the plunge in 40B permits. I mean, that's a really amazing law aimed squarely at the biggest problem we've been talking about, which is the lack of receptivity to multifamily housing in many communities. So what's going on there? I don't know. Maybe somebody in this room does, but that's an example of something that has really made a difference, that we can't allow that to fall into disuse. We've got to look at what we can do to enhance it or make fuller use of it, as Brockton is doing with 40S. So that's one point. Second is we've got to recruit the business community to this cause. Because we can make the case that this is directly related to the thing that they are most worried about. When Jay Ash went around shortly after being appointed secretary in the Baker administration and talked to CEO after CEO across the state, what's your number one concern? Virtually every business leader said talent. That's our concern. Is the talent going to be here so that our businesses can thrive? Well, that's an opportunity to say, part of the talent being here is to afford to live somewhere, and we need the business community to make that connection and to be talking to the Senator Forrys of the world about how important this is in terms of the overall prosperity of the state. Finally, in terms of the reurbanization that's going on, I'd like to see even more of it, because we need density as one route to affordability. And you know, as Barry pointed out, Boston had 800,000 people once upon a time. We're growing again, but we're not close to 800,000. The city of Paris, with roughly the same land area as Boston, has 3 times the population. And last time I was there, it looked pretty good to me. I don't know how you feel. And yet, even in the cities, there's opposition to density. And we're going to have some political resolve around just insisting that we take particularly the transit-oriented opportunities and the publicly owned land that can be made available by the state, the MBTA, the city, that we really look at those for dense development and remind people that what they like about city living, and there is a city living renaissance going on very significantly, what they like about that is completely a function of density. That's what creates what we enjoy, what we love about cities. Got to make that case.
Thank you. Any additional?
You know, you hate to be first because you're not sure if you're going to be creative enough. You hate being last because then everything's been said and you're not unique enough. So here I am at the end.
Bring us home.
I think, you know, we really need to look at housing as a regional issue, not just city by city, but regionally. And we need some land use control to go along with that. And being, you know, very home rule, you know, we're all fighting over that sacred tax dollar, but how can we work together to solve these issues? It doesn't all have to happen in community X. It can happen in community Y, and there could be some sort of sharing maybe. We have to get out of the silos, because housing is economic development. Housing is and affects transportation. Housing does affect our water resources, and I think that's become very critical in the last year, where I'm watching communities, you know, going dry in some places. Brockton has water. Come on in. Plenty of water. But we need to break down those barriers, and I'm glad that, you know, in Massachusetts we have a Department of Housing and Community Development, as opposed to being 2 separate organizations. And lastly, you know, I think that given the educational institutions here and the great work of the Boston Foundation, I think there's some opportunities to do some experimentation and to get some really unique things going, you know, whether it's through the legislative process or just doing it on site and doing it on your own. So I think that there's excellent opportunity for collaboration and experimentation.
Thank
Becky,
you.
can I have some good news on 40B?
Sure.
I know that slide looks depressing, that the numbers are going down, but the good news is that's only one piece of the story. That data is the municipal self-reporting that the state has and does not include all the activity that's actually happening. So many, the subsidizing agencies who approve the 40B developments are actually seeing a lot of activity right now, and it's much more positive than it looked on that slide. So it's just a matter of looking at the different sides and making sure that we're getting all of the data to know the whole story. So it is better than we think.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So speaking of getting to the whole story, we are going to move to Q&A now. We have about 10, 15 minutes for Q&A. So let me just be clear about what Q&A means. Just so we're clear, everybody. Q means questions, not statements. Please wait for the microphone. We have some folks roving in the middle, Lucy and Michelle. And please introduce yourself before you ask your question. So, let's see. Mike, over there, Lucy.
Good morning.
Morning.
Mike Hogan from the Makepeace Companies and one of the co-chairs of the Commonwealth Housing Task Force. Thank you to the Boston Foundation to continue convening the task force, and thank you to Barry for the report. We've had some hidden information in the reports over the last couple of years about the aging of Massachusetts, and when you look at the report, we're really have an Achilles heel of that workforce that we need to fuel our growth is aging in place, and there aren't a lot of new folks who are staying. In fact, the younger demographic is leaving. So the question to Peter first, and then to the rest of the panel, we've made this argument as the right thing to do and a moral imperative for a long time. What are you hearing from your members, Peter, about the economic imperative, and how can we build on that to get some real momentum behind creating new housing models?
It's not intuitive to most business people. We found when we did we just completed an 18-month economic study, looked at the area. We thought the South Shore was a very vibrant, strong area. It was eye-opening for most of our members who have heard the presentation or looked at it to realize that we are aging as fast as we are, and what the implications are for the economy and future home values because of that. So it's an education process that we're finding with community business leaders who don't spend a lot of time on housing policy or economic development. When they hear it, people get that case pretty quickly, but it has to be told, and that's, as I think Paul mentioned, getting the business community involved in this discussion about housing and community development is critical.
Thank you. Let's see, Chris.
Chris Norris from Metropolitan Boston Housing Partnership. In his presentation, Barry mentioned the increase in family homelessness and the increase in the length of stay in shelters. And in fact, over the last 15 years, we've watched the Commonwealth go from housing 800 families a night who are homeless to housing more than 3,500 families a night who are homeless. My question for Rachel and Paul would be, what could be done on a policy level, Commonwealth-wide, to address that? And for the other three speakers, are there examples or models in your community of significant production of housing stock for the lowest income households? And if so, might that be able to be replicated?
Paul, do you want to take it first?
I'm going to refer it back to you, Rebecca. You've been doing a lot of work on this issue.
So why don't we start with Rachel, and I can chime in as well.
Okay.
After you're done, I say something.
Okay, perfect. We all want to talk about this issue. It is such a big issue, and I think the report highlights just how many people are struggling. And while we have many families living in shelters, we also have many more who are doubled up or tripled up in situations that are not safe or sustainable. So there is a lot that we need to do to increase housing stability and economic stability as well as economic mobility. I think we need to recognize that we have a lot of low-wage job growth as well as the high-wage job growth. And we need to provide more housing opportunities, but we also need to make sure that those other programs that help people to afford housing are in place and are allowing people to work and not go over a cliff where they can no longer be stable in their housing. It's very difficult for people to make it. And the mayor was talking about self-sufficiency. It's really hard. I don't think any of us are purely self-sufficient. And housing is our base. We all need that home. But then we need to be able to have a safe place to send our kids for the day. We need to be able to get to work. And so I think we need to be thinking about all of those other supports that people need and making sure that things work well together to really help people be stable.
Yep. Mayor Warren, did you want to chime in?
Yep, and just really quickly, someone had asked about the business community. One of the things on the more controversial projects we got passed that I referenced, the Austin Street mixed use unit, we enlisted the Chamber of Commerce, Newton Needham Chamber of Commerce, and they did a tremendous amount of work along with our residents to help get that passed. If it weren't for them at the table with us, making the case that this is good for the business community, we wouldn't have done it. So I do think there's a critical component there. On the homelessness, so this is, I believe that this is obviously one of the more complex issues of our time, homelessness. So there is some really interesting work going on in communities around the country around this issue. There's an organization that was formerly known as the Clinton Women's Union, now called NPATH, that have seen some real evidence in moving children and families to self-sufficiently that had formerly been homeless. I won't go through the full description of what they do because it's somewhat complicated. It's based on science and the idea around wraparound services and working intensely with the parent and the child. We are piloting a program with them in the city of Newton and Newton Public Housing. What we found was that the kids coming from lower income households that are going into public school classrooms with wealthier kids were not achieving as well. And when they got into kindergarten and thereafter, kids of wealthier households had the sort of financial and connectivity foundation to get their kids what they needed. Kids that were not fell off. So we have this growing achievement gap in the city of Newton Public Schools. So in addition to doing some things inside the classroom, we're working with them, with families in public housing. We're also taking, first time, a bricks and mortar public building in Newton Center, an old library, with good public transit. There's a Green Line right there. There's a commercial element there. I propose converting that into some commercial on the bottom and then housing on the top for children and families that are chronically homeless, with the wraparound services that perhaps NPATH could provide. As a model, we could look at expanding. We've got to combine the bricks and mortar with the physical infrastructure of transportation, daycare, and all the rest, and the wraparound services together. And I think there is some great work going on out there, but I think we need to expand it, we need to scale it, and we need to measure it. So there is some success there I've seen with some organizations.
Can I just add one more thing about that rental subsidies? We just need so much more in rental subsidies. We have over 100,000 people in Section 8 waiting list. We don't know, we haven't seen an influx of Section 8s in the last several years. I don't know that we'll see much more coming in the next 4 years. And we have our own state rental subsidy program, and we have to really build that up. While it's going strong and it's funded at almost $90 million, it used to serve 18,000 households. It now serves about half of that. It used to be funded at $120 million. We're now at $88 million. So we need to really put a lot of work into that program too.
Yep. And just one thing I would add in response to that, and then I'll go to other questions, including one on Twitter, is that the Boston Foundation is going to be releasing a report early next year looking at the operations and the outcomes from the statewide family shelter system. So please keep tuned, and hopefully that will answer some of these questions about sort of what's working, who's staying the longest, and what are the possible policy changes we could be making. So further questions? Hi. So why don't we go here?
My name is Lisa Zimmerman. I'm a member of the Massachusetts Board of Massachusetts Association of Housing Cooperatives, of which there are not too many in the state, but lots in New York. But that's not my question.
Okay.
I live in Kenmore Square. So if I ask, what should be the role of historic significance and aesthetics as we plan ahead in our building? The Boston Globe reported that by 2030, if we continue to build at the rate we're building, we will have total gridlock. Now, who thinks we have to wait till 2030 for total gridlock? Question, aesthetics and historical significance.
Thank you.
So, in the nice leafy suburbs of the South Shore, I think one of the goals that we have when we're looking at housing, we have a housing task force that we've just appointed. 2 of your Senate colleagues are going to serve on it. We're looking at this issue of historic preservation and reuse of buildings. I think we'll end up looking at this issue of historic preservation and reuse as a way to bring in more housing into small downtown community centers. Now, that's not huge economic growth. It's not going to create a new pharma industry at all, but it is a way to increase housing stock and bring new life into smaller villages and smaller town centers. And I think looking at some of that reuse historic building could be an interesting way to encourage new growth in order to preserve the quiet little town centers that everyone remembers and claims they want to keep.
I think historic preservation and aesthetics are critical to our communities. And I think that using these historic tax credits is a great opportunity to reinvest in our downtowns and the older buildings. However, it is very cumbersome and difficult to get historic tax credits. The way the state allocates them, and I'm not going to open up that can of worms, but we need to find a better way of enforcing that kind of investment, especially when we're looking at transit-oriented communities. Aesthetically, right now we have site plan review, which is not authorized by the legislation in 40A, but it's kind of become an acceptable practice, and so therefore it's, you know, we're doing it because we are. But the zoning reform legislation that passed out of the Senate has codified 40 or has site plan review or site plan approval, and I think that as municipalities bring this to the local table, that we really look at aesthetic values and how it's going to affect our community. How do buildings and new development interact with the built environment that we have now? And so it's critical.
Did you want to jump in, Paul?
Yeah, just I couldn't agree more. I think it's absolutely critical. It's a big part of the new appeal of cities is the history that's there, and only cities really have the capacity to preserve and transmit a cultural legacy, and the shape of the city, the architecture of it is part of that cultural legacy. The other thing we have to do, though, is when we have new opportunities, not just be historically literate about what we build, but you know, having the right quality of what we're doing and being willing to be bold and different. And there's a widespread view that we have blown the seaport from an architecture point of view, that we've blown it. And that's sickening in a way, to have that kind of incredible opportunity open up for this city because the harbor got cleaned up with help from the Boston Foundation. And we, you know, it just, so there wasn't this sensibility or kind of influence of design and in how that process played out. And we just can't let that continue. It's just squandering what is one of the great virtues and appeals of cities.
Thank you. So I'm going to take one question from this side of the room, and then we're going to do one question on Twitter and move along.
Yes, David Geller, wonderful presentation, wonderful panel. Nobody emphasized the cost side of the equation, the cost of developing new housing, which in my opinion is getting worse as interest rates rise and as labor shortages become more and more obvious with the growth of the city. So the question is, this all leads into, is there a potential at a very significant level to do manufactured housing, factory-built manufactured housing, as a way of addressing the cost side of the equation, as a way of providing vocational opportunities for many, many young people who are otherwise looking at a difficult way of supporting themselves and their future families. And I think, looking around the world, it's happening at scale. There's no reason it should not happen here.
Does someone on the panel want to take that, or do I go to our pinch
I-
hitter? Okay, go ahead.
I think that's interesting. It was interesting that the report touched on that. I think that addresses a piece of the cost. The biggest cost drivers for housing, from other studies that we've seen, are land cost and because of zoning, and time cost because of permitting. So if you, and I think that's one reason that we've seen an increase in multifamily permitting, because higher density, multiple units is about the only way you can afford it. If you really want to get at some of the cost of housing, you've got to tackle land use zoning and time cost permitting.
I would say that communities like ours, where we could see additional affordable or even market rate housing that is adjacent to transit or on transit or served by transit, so we don't have further sprawl, we need to start looking up. And modular is one of those ways of holding down those costs. Our city government has gotten very aggressive in making property available for development, and we hope to attract more real estate development people, but we need to go up. If we continue to look at small houses and going out as we get farther away, there's a role for small houses, so don't tweet me. But we can't continue to convert farmland into new residential developments to support our housing crisis, because we don't have water out there, we don't have roads, and we don't have jobs out there. So how do we work with that and go up is my issue.
Yeah.
Can I just, I keep referring to the Austin Street project, but it was the most recent one. That actually, because of that sort of pre-constructed work, that actually lowered the cost of the project, which allowed us to work with the developer to, I think, get a higher percentage, 30%, 33% affordable units within that project. So number one, I agree with you completely. Number two, when you look at the rate of youth unemployment, that's rather high right now, and you look at different segments of our population that are not in the workforce, affordability for college is an issue. Some have started college and went back to work. They can't afford to get back in for various reasons. I think when you look at creating jobs in places where people live, I actually think that is a creative solution. Barry, you touched upon this, in different regions that have not been touched by the Seaport District in Cambridge and the great life sciences and health and all the things that are happening in the state. One of the questions we have to sort of grapple with is how do we extend the possibility of higher wage jobs and workforce training and apprenticeships that go along with it. So it's not the answer, but I do think it could be a part of the answer. I think it's a great comment.
So we are almost out of time, and I would love to take more questions, but so I apologize. Please come and chat with the panelists afterwards, but I want to turn it over to Paul to make any final remarks you have before we adjourn for today.
Well, I'll be very brief. Again, I want to thank all of you. This has been a great session, and everybody is kind of on the edge of their seat. This is so important to our community. Again, I want to thank Barry and his colleagues for their superb work. On the cost issue, by the way, in fairness, we should remind everybody that was the centerpiece of last year's report. So the cost thing is very much on our minds, even though it was not featured as much this year. Again, I guess I'm the historian. Back in 1986, it was a very implausible time to contemplate getting a housing program enacted at the federal level. Ronald Reagan was president, the withdrawal from the cities, the general direction of that. Yet somehow, a small band of entrepreneurs got the low-income housing tax credit passed that year. And it's still there 30 years later because it's had the kind of bipartisan support and good results. I hope that's a little bit of an inspiration that there are going to be opportunities to do things, even in a climate that some of us may view as less than ideal. And we've got to be alive to those opportunities and take advantage of what is still our greatest quality as a community, which is the imagination and creativity of so many people here and so many people who are in the housing field. So thank you for being here. We're going to stay with this issue. You can rest assured on that.
Thank you to the panelists.
Your pleasure.
My pleasure.